Hi, Dan.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Let me introduce us. You are already familiar to many viewers and listeners of Blogging Heads TV as Dan Drezner. You appear on the irregularly produced but regularly illuminating podcast Dresbert, which is known by thought leaders and public intellectuals alike as the best foreign policy podcast. Plus, you're a political scientist at Tufts, write the spoilers alert blog for Washington Post, and so on. But more important than any of this for our purposes, you've written a really interesting book, which conveniently you're holding up now, The Ideas Industry, How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas.
I am indeed.
Which I found really, really interesting, all the more so since I occasionally try to inject an idea into the ideas industry, usually with limited success. So tell me if I'm oversimplifying your thesis here, Dan.
Okay.
Public intellectuals good, thought leaders evil.
Yes, you are definitely oversimplifying.
I thought I'd give you the opportunity to clarify that. So first, tell us what the distinction is.
Okay, so basically I say that there are two kinds of intellectuals that contribute to the marketplace of ideas, and I label them as public intellectuals and thought leaders. And for those listeners who object to those labels, let me just point out that I could have come up with any label and you wouldn't have liked it anyway, because it's the categories people don't necessarily like rather than the labels. Public intellectuals are essentially Isaiah Berlin's foxes of the intellectual world, which is they absolutely have some area of expertise, but they also know a little bit about a lot. They're perfectly willing to opine on other matters. They are critics. They're someone who can tell you everything that is wrong with everyone else's idea. Thought leaders are Isaiah Berlin's hedgehogs. They know one big thing, and if you throw any kind of policy problem or social dilemma or what have you at them, they will somehow find a way to fit it into their one big thing as a way of explanation. So if public intellectuals are critics, thought leaders are evangelists. Thought leaders can use their idea to explain everything that is wrong and presumably find a recipe or some kind of solution. Now, the argument I make in the book is that the marketplace of ideas needs both of these kinds of thinkers. Mm-hmm. You need thought leaders to constantly introduce new ideas into the marketplace of ideas, and you also need public intellectuals to criticize those ideas to within an inch of their lives. Mm-hmm. If you have a marketplace that is dominated by public intellectuals, the barriers to entry are too high. It's a stagnant marketplace. Essentially, ideas get ossified and calcified, and not much new is talked about. And that's not healthy, I think, because we constantly have new problems presenting themselves. If, on the other hand, the marketplace of ideas is dominated by thought leaders, then the barriers to exit are too high. And what that means is that you have a lot of interesting, potentially heterogeneous ideas being proposed, and you also have a lot of stupid ideas that will not die, because public intellectuals aren't there to skewer them to within an inch of their lives. And basically what I'm arguing in the book is not so much public intellectuals good, thought leaders bad, but rather there's a variety of forces, way beyond the marketplace of ideas that have to do with sort of the nature of American political economy that have essentially rewarded thought leaders and penalized public intellectuals. And so that's right. the situation we find ourselves in now.
Right. And before we get into those things, want to give us some examples of people that we would have heard of who fall into the two categories?
Sure. So when I talk about public intellectuals, I have a chapter on this. I think Fareed Zakaria is an excellent example of a public intellectual. Fareed has an impeccable intellectual pedigree. He's written some interesting books. He's obviously a columnist for the Washington Post as well as a commentator for CNN. But the interesting thing about Zakaria is that he holds his own views very close to the vest.
Right.
In researching the book, I was struck reading all the profiles of Zakaria, the degree to which he has been labeled at various times a liberal, a centrist, a conservative, and a neoconservative. His job essentially is to appear as that of the wise man and to critique others, which he does reasonably well in his Post column. A thought leader would be someone like Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson, equally impeccable credentials, by the way, and this is something I do want to stress, which is that thought leaders very often have just the same kind of pedigree that public intellectuals have. But Ferguson has a very distinct worldview. He's definitely, sort of conservative, and he is furthermore a happy conservative warrior. He is someone who clearly enjoys the scrum, as it were. And, you know, delights in pointing out or torturing, in some cases, intellectually torturing, his adversaries in a way that I don't think Zakaria does. So that's one sort of, those are sort of the archetypes that we can talk about. I can give you other examples if you want them.
Yeah, no, I think that'll do. And I'm sure you'd agree some people are hard to fit into one category. The other,
yes,
you know.
I think I even talk about this in the book, that someone like Jeffrey Sachs, there are people that can pivot from one to the other. So like Jeffrey Sachs, for example, I think for a lot of his career, when he wrote publicly, functioned as a public intellectual. But during the period where he argued he could end poverty as we know it, he functioned completely like a thought leader.
Mm-hmm. So there is a correlation here with kind of intensity of ideology. That's part of what you're saying. I mean, that's not what literally the hedgehog-fox distinction that Isaiah Berlin made necessarily maps onto, right? I mean, you could be a physicist who has one grand theory of the universe, and it wouldn't be, you'd be a hedgehog, but it wouldn't be ideological at all. But the way you're using these, you're seeing a correlation between hedgehogism and intensity of ideology on this landscape.
Well, one of the things I say that's driving or essentially enabling thought leaders is the political polarization of the country, right. Which is, you know, there's a whole array of data you can point to showing that, you know, essentially elite Republicans are moving further to the right, elite Democrats are moving further to the left, and there's enough partisan sorting going on so that essentially each ideological grouping wants their own house intellectuals. So therefore, someone who is willing to cater to that particular ideological base is going to thrive much more in this environment than someone who might be a public intellectual who even might agree with, let's say, conservatives a fair amount of the time, but might say, hey, you know what, I think liberals have a point when it comes to healthcare or something like that. And so as a result, there's sort of a seeking out of ideological purity, which means that those thought leaders that are perfectly willing to tell these bases that they're completely right are the ones who are going to thrive in this kind of environment.
Right. So you get in a polarized environment, you get positive reinforcement for being ideological. And you know, you feel this on Twitter, right? If you just look at the way different tweets of yours play, there's a constant temptation to be as intensely ideological as possible, because I mean, especially in the age of Trump, right?
Yeah.
Because the snarky you are, the more retweets you get, and I've certainly not been entirely immune to that inducement. But
we're all vulnerable to. I'm certainly vulnerable to this as well. Yeah.
And so so you list three things that have been conducive to this rise of thought leaders. That is one, the political polarization. What are the other two?
The other two are, first, the erosion of trust in authority and expertise. And so here again, there's a welter of public opinion data that shows that basically from the mid-1960s onward, Americans have reduced their trust, not just in the federal government, but in almost every major institution in the United States outside of the military, to the point where, you know, trust in almost all of these institutions are at record lows post-2008. And in particular, the General Social Survey surveys Americans about their attitudes about knowledge institutions, as it were, education, medicine, and so forth. The average degree of confidence in those institutions in 1974 was approximately 50%. In 2012, it was down to 30%. So the effect of this is that it essentially strips public intellectuals of one of their easiest sort of rhetorical gambits, which is to argue from authority. This isn't to say that this is necessarily a good tactic or one I approve of, but it used to be that back in the day, if you were a Harvard professor and you said, this idea is silly, many people reading you would say, oh, a Harvard professor says this idea is silly, ergo it must be silly. Nowadays, if someone does that, doesn't matter if they're a Harvard professor.
It helps, but... It helps
a little bit, but not as much as it used to, is my point.
No.
You know, it doesn't matter if they're a Pulitzer Prize winner or a Nobel Prize winner or a MacArthur Genius Grant winner. These things still carry weight. You're absolutely correct about that. But they carry far less weight than they did 40 years ago. And that's my point. Whereas, on the other hand, thought leaders very often emerge, even if they have, you know, decent intellectual training, they are often emerging from their own experience or from the private sector, or they don't necessarily have the sort of traditional intellectual accoutrement that gives them that same kind of prestige, but it doesn't necessarily matter as much in today's world. Indeed, the sort of search for authenticity in some ways can give these kinds of thought leaders greater credibility. Think J.D. Vance, for example, in Hillbilly Elegy, which is an interesting argument. And again, I don't mean to diminish the idea that it's a valid argument, but it's an argument born from his own experience.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's interesting that that's in a sense, that book is, although it was written, I guess, before Trump was elected, it's a book partly about Trumpism and Trump's base, and that itself, the rise of Trump is sometimes attributed partly to the declining authority of elites. I mean, he basically, the Republican Party might as well have not existed. I mean, he just, nobody in the Republican Party wanted him to be the nominee. Nobody up at the higher echelons, pretty much, and yet there he was. I mean, there's also, so credentialing matters less as you say, as trust in the traditional credentialers wanes. Also, there are new avenues of entry for these people. I mean, now that you can just show up on YouTube and maybe gather a following, or there's more media outlets online and so on, and that makes it easier too for the uncredentialed, the not formally credentialed person.
Right. Essentially, the gatekeepers have fallen. Which is, again, not, as you say, those gates still matter. I mean, it matters if you publish in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, as opposed to, let's say, Medium. But you can never tell. There are times where a Medium post or a YouTube clip goes viral in a way that simply could not have existed 50 years ago. So there, in that sense, it's still possible to sort of crack the higher tiers of the marketplace of ideas. So that's one of the trends. Rise of political polarization is the second. The third is the rise of economic inequality. And again, this is by and large indisputable in terms of the raw data. What matters here is that essentially you have a new class of plutocrats that now exist that have more money than they know what to do with. And it turns out what they want to do is go back to college. But they don't go back to college. What they do is essentially create or fund their own intellectual salon. And so as a result, you have people like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or the Koch brothers, whenever they're interviewed talking about how much they care about ideas, how much they want to foster these kinds of ideas, setting up foundations or institutes or what have you to further these kinds of ideas. And as it turns out, the kind of intellectuals that they are interested in engaging are the kinds of intellectuals that will reinforce their preconceived worldviews. And there are two awkward, sticky facts of life here. The first is that regardless of, a wealthy benefactor's sort of declared political ideology, I would argue that to some extent these kinds of plutocrats all do share a certain kind of worldview at a baser level, which is the notion that essentially politics is a messy business, and essentially it is far better to do than to think. And so in looking at politics, it's just a sort of piece of faulty code that should be hacked in some ways. So they're constantly looking for... Hacked
in the sense of, you mean in the sense of kind of circumvented? In other words, you find a solution outside the political realm?
Exactly.
Because this is the classic TED Talk. It says, yes, we can solve this problem, and then you listen to the solution. The government's not involved, right?
Right. And in fact, the TED Talk is the perfect example of what the plutocrat wants to hear. It's short, it's punchy, it offers an inspirational message of empowerment, and it's entirely consistent with what, in these plutocrats' minds, how they got to where they are in the first place. And so as a result, it rewards thought leaders who are willing to tell them that. If you think, in the 20th century, the purpose of the public intellectual in theory was that they were supposed to speak truth to power. Now, that didn't happen as often as it was claimed, but nonetheless, that was the goal. If you think speaking truth to power is hard, try speaking truth to money. That is much harder. And so a lot of intellectuals will be perfectly happy to tell these thought leaders, to tell these plutocrats exactly what they want to hear, or to give them a message. And to be fair, I think it's not that they're altering their own, philosophies. I think in most cases they genuinely believe this stuff.
This is a common confusion of people to see that, like, okay, you're at some think tank that gets money from such and you're saying the thing that such and such likes, and so you're a whore. No, actually, these think tanks just go out and hire people who already believe the things that they want said.
Right, because that's a much better way of doing things. You want true believers. But what it changes is, I guess to use a fancy term, the population ecology of intellectuals, which is to say the ones that thrive in this kind of environment are the ones that can tell plutocrats what they already believe to be true.
Now, we should say that TED is, in a certain sense, not the purest example of plutocratic subsidy, because it's not a case of people who are like getting grants from foundations run by plutocrats. I mean, TED is actually, I think, a for-profit thing where it's a great business model where affluent people from the entertainment and design and technology community pay real money to come to this thing, and then people give talks. So the arbiter is, in a way, this group of people who are certainly affluent, that constitutes the TED audience. I mean, at least they're a big part of the arbiter. But I see your point that there is. I mean, first of all, it started in California, even though I guess it's now sometimes in Canada. But it's there's certainly a Silicon Valley vibe to TED, right. And there's a Silicon Valley vibe to a lot of plutocrats. So, right.
Right, and the other way to think, I mean, TED. I mean, actually, for the intellectual, TED is, you don't get paid for a TED talk. I don't believe.
No, you don't.
But the way to think about TED is that it's a loss leader. Essentially, if you make this talk and it's reasonably successful, most cases you're making this talk and it becomes, potentially a book, or you wind up getting on the lecture circuit, which is in and of itself a sort of new form of way in which people can make money, and you wind up in this kind of superstar economy where essentially the most successful intellectuals now can earn upwards of 7 figures giving talks or writing books or making television documentaries based on the books or what have you, which, again, to someone in tech or finance doesn't sound like a lot, but for those of us who struggle to get a PhD, sounds like a fantastic sum of money. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, there are people who will be very tempted to pursue that course of action if they can get it.
Right. Okay. So you've got these 3 factors: polarization, declining trust in traditional sources of authority, and this kind of concentration of wealth or whatever that makes intellectuals in many cases dependent on patrons, right?
Right. I mean, intellectuals in some ways have always been dependent on patrons. That's not unique. What has changed is that essentially there's been a change in the balance of funding. That, in the 20th century, particularly in the latter 20th century, you had, academics who were relying upon federal government, funding, particularly in foreign policy in my area, and you had traditional foundations that were also perfectly willing to fund that. In recent years, those sources of funding haven't disappeared, but they've definitely been reduced, and you have these new kinds of sources of funding that are more partisan or sort of more apolitical, for lack of a better way of putting it, that have stepped up, and as a result, those kinds of funders reward different kinds of intellectuals and different kind of intellectual institutions.
And they do it via think tanks, for one thing, right? They do it sometimes via universities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that certainly happens. And I don't mean to say, by the way, that universities are only populated by public intellectuals. There are an awful lot of thought leaders in the academy as well, and the ones who excel are the ones who can actually manage to take money from benefactors and produce ideas that are potentially compelling to them. In terms of the think tank world, I think it benefits some think tanks and not others. So I think Heritage, for example, has thrived in this kind of environment. And indeed, they're the one conservative think tank, you can argue, that has actually enhanced their influence because of the Trump administration, because of Trump winning the presidency. But it is because they are so partisan and because they were willing to cater to Trump that it worked. Whereas other think tanks that sort of espouse a more nonpartisan worldview, think the Council on Foreign Relations, or to a lesser extent Brookings, are more negatively affected because in some of these cases they wound up searching for new sources of funding which have led them to be vulnerable to charges of conflict of interest, even if there's no actual conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And one of the ironies about this, which I do also talk about in the book, is that nonprofit think tanks have been accused of hypocrisy, of taking money from various sources as a way of producing their output. And weirdly, for-profit think tanks have actually thrived in this kind of climate, I think because they're explicitly for-profit.
Yeah, now that the rise of the for-profit think tank is something you spend some time on, and it basically grows out of the kind of the consultancy business, right? It's like McKinsey kind of now has its kind of think tank, and there are these new, Oxford Analytica, not to be confused with Cambridge Analytica, which is a different kind of thing. But, and one thing that made me think, I mean, you said sometimes their analysis, in theory, as you know, you would think their analysis might be good because they're subjected to the forces of the market.
Right.
Now, this brings me to I guess back to the question of, what is it? Are there perspectives being left out of the foreign policy? I mean, this is you spend more time on foreign policy than on many things because this is your bailiwick.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned Ian Bremmer. And it has occurred to me, I don't know that much about him, but I kind of follow him on Twitter. He's a for-profit guy, right?
Yeah.
He's associated. He's got his own thing. He is a brand.
He's the founder of Eurasia Group.
And it struck me that, two things. I fairly often agree with him. He's pretty, he seems to me a little, and I think one reason is he's a little more of a realist than you generally find in the Washington think tank structure. You don't agree with that, or?
No, I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I don't know if Ian's worldview is necessarily distinct from others that I know in the think tank community. So I mean, maybe he's a little more realist, but I've known Ian. We went to grad school together, so I've known
really?
Time, yeah.
Well, he's pretty successful. Well, what I was going to ask, does he represent a case where the philanthropically supported realm of ideas is leaving something out that he feels, but you seem to think not?
No, I mean,
for further context, of course, President Obama and his assistant Ben Rhodes famously referred to the Washington foreign policy establishment as the blob, and I kind of know what they mean because look, you got your neocons, you got your liberal interventionists. That's 90% of it, and very often they agree on things, right? So that's what was meant, and I didn't find Bremmer fitting easily into either of those camps, and maybe so in a way that's the context of my question. But
yeah, no, that's fair. I think that's a safe statement. And there are ways in which, as I said, and this hopefully came across in the book. I don't necessarily think it's automatically a bad thing that you have the McKinseys of the world or the Eurasia groups of the world trying to contribute to the marketplace of ideas. I do think they can potentially offer, because of different kinds of training and different kinds of background, an alternative perspective. My concern is that essentially, are we at this sort of brief moment where you still have these traditional think tanks and these for-profit think tanks, or is it this case that if trends continue, and I sort of outlined this a little more clearly in something I wrote for the Washington Post, is this like a brief moment, and then eventually the for-profit world is simply going to eclipse the non-profit world, and then I would have some problems because the for-profit think tanks have as many blind spots as traditional think tanks. I mean, you're right about the blob to some extent. And it was one of the things that actually unified Obama and Trump, you could argue, was that neither of them are particularly enamored of the blob. But that said, one of the things the blob actually does focus on are trouble spots in the world. And the thing about the for-profit areas is that they're not going to focus as much on trouble spots because trouble spots tend not to be all that profitable. So, they will focus on other areas, and in some ways that's valuable. The fact that, the way technology might change international affairs is something that more traditional think tanks have been a little, slower on the uptake on in some cases. So I think that's a good thing. But I do think that if you wind up with the sort of McKinsey Global Institutes of the world being the primary sources of input to how governments and publics think, there's going to be a lot of blind spots that emerge. Okay,
so the focus on the trouble spots. Now, your subtitle is How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas. And I gather, is that what you mean by the pessimists, that there's an incentive in some sectors to focus on trouble spots?
Well, when I meant pessimist, I was talking about, I confess I was going for the alliteration here. So pessimist refers to the erosion.
Originally you had optimist, but it didn't start with a P, and so you changed it
exactly,
to pessimist.
So I went with no. What I meant by pessimist was those who are skeptical of institutions and authority and expertise. Okay. So those are the pessimists in that sense.
Because, one reason the subtitle surprised me, now I know more what you meant, but when I first saw the subtitle, I thought, well, parts of the thought leader ecosystem, like the classic TED Talk, is ultimately optimistic, right?
Yes.
It's we can do this, and we don't, and again, we probably don't need the government.
No, that's absolutely true. And again, the way in which the format always ends, it always ends with a standing ovation. It's this, in some ways, it's almost like a religious sermon rather than an intellectual talk, although the two are very, interrelated. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and let me put it this way. When I meant pessimists about traditional sources of intellectual authority. These pessimists, on the other hand, will often embrace TED Talks, in the same way that, let's say, skeptics of modern medicine might embrace homeopathic drugs as well. Mm-hmm. So very often someone who proclaims themselves to be a pessimist about something are actually only a partial pessimist. They're pessimists about one set of things, but then they wind up embracing something else as a substitute.
Okay. Let me tell you something I had noticed independently about the profession of journalism, and see if this is related to what you're talking about. I think it is. But over in the decades that I've been involved in journalism, it seems to have become the case that more and more journalists are expected to do their own. Well, self-promotion is a more important part of being a journalist.
Yeah.
They are. I mean, it used to be that the deal was magazine hires you or pays for your writing. You do the writing, they do the promotion.
Right.
Well, now there are, media outlets that hire people partly on the basis that they have a lot of Twitter followers, so they can do the promoting, right? Yeah. Because, whatever. So is this like related to the rise of thought leaders?
I wouldn't know. I mean, it's partially related to the rise of thought leaders in that one of the advantages that thought leaders have, I would argue, in the marketplace of ideas as opposed to public intellectuals is that thought leaders have the supreme self-confidence that they are absolutely right. Whereas, as a general rule, public intellectuals can be very, very arrogant, but usually they're most arrogant when they're convinced someone else is wrong. They're not necessarily convinced that they themselves are correct. And so as a result, public intellectuals, when they try to advertise for themselves, they can succeed, they can do this, and they can potentially do it well, but there's always going to be a little twinge of guilt. Thought leaders, on the other hand, are often better at self-promotion, because they think, why not? I am absolutely convinced I am right. I therefore want others to recognize my own, my particular rightness. And I've seen this in every venue. I've seen this in the academy, and I've seen this in more public formats. And there is no denying, I mean, we are hardwired in some ways as human beings to be more attracted to the person that has the sure solution rather than the person who says, well, it's complicated, or, well, there's a trade-off here. And, there's no denying that sort of the explosion of social media, the explosion of media platforms has essentially meant that what intellectuals are doing now is creating their own brands. So it's even worse than you said. It's not just that, it used to be that the writer would write the magazine piece and then the magazine would take it and market it. It's that you as the writer can no longer just write a magazine piece. You not only have to write the magazine piece and then tweet about it and do a Facebook live chat and do a Reddit, AMA about it. You also then have to make sure you have a regular column somewhere and a regular TV appearance somewhere else. And that you're working on a book, and then you'll go on a book promotion tour, or you'll be making a documentary, or there are certain conferences you're going to get invited to. And so as a result, it's exhausting. You're working hard. One of the interesting things about the rise of economic inequality is that today's rich works far harder than the wealthy of old, because the wealthy of old were wealthy the old-fashioned way because they inherited it. Whereas to some extent, sort of modern plutocrats, that's less of a factor, although we'll see going forward. And I think that is true of intellectuals as well. People who are successful, people who are superstar intellectuals, are working extremely hard to maintain their brand. And it's not a coincidence. So I did this survey in the book, asking people who they thought the most influential intellectual was, and the answer, which was not entirely shocking, is Henry Kissinger. Which in some ways you might think is cheating, because Kissinger did used to be Secretary of State and so forth. So it's not shocking that it would be thought to be influential as a foreign policy thinker. But I would argue that the reason that Kissinger is influential is not just because of that past policy experience, but that Kissinger has actually innovated what the post-policy principal career is. Most people who had served in the cabinet and then retired would then decide to work at a think tank, or maybe they would write one memoir, and that would be about it. Kissinger created his own consultancy and has managed to maintain that kind of relevancy for the last 30 years now, which makes him unusual in that sense. And you've seen other later policy principals like Madeleine Albright or Sandy Berger or Condi Rice or Bob Gates following that lead now.
Right. Okay. So one thing that I think you show in the book is how it's possible for a thought leader's idea, even if faulty, to catch on and carry the day for a long, long time. You talk about this disrupt concept, right? Who's the guy?
Disruptive innovation. Yeah, Clayton Christensen, who was a professor at Harvard Business School, and in some ways that was one of those cases where, writing the chapter, I kind of realized in the process of writing it what the argument that it kind of crystallized what I was trying to say, as it were, which is that Christensen came up with a genuinely interesting idea about management theory, which is unusual. I mean, it really is an interesting idea, and I would encourage people to understand that he might actually be onto something within his particular sector. The problem is that he basically made this case that essentially a firm, a leading firm in a sector could do everything absolutely correctly in terms of how it was supposed to cater to its customer base, in terms of how it was supposed to generate sustaining innovations, and it could still get totally upended if there was a disruptor who essentially managed to somehow develop a niche market and then from that eventually learn how to do everything related to that product better than the market leader. And it's an incredibly counterintuitive idea because it basically tells you everything you thought about the proper way to manage a firm is wrong. And what was interesting researching this was the degree to which Christensen took this idea and ran with it, arguing that it essentially did not just explain certain sectors of, let's say, the software industry, but rather it also explained healthcare, it explained education, both primary and higher education. He argued it could explain Iraq. He basically pushed it to its outer limits until finally he encountered pushback from public intellectuals like Jill Lepore at Harvard University, and then eventually, within his own management field, you started seeing more grounded research suggesting that he had vastly exaggerated the impact of disruptive innovation. And in some ways, by that point, it's almost too late. The idea of disruption now has permeated our discourse entirely. And as someone who studies foreign policy, I am genuinely gobsmacked at the amount of time you will see that metaphor being applied to explaining certain ideas in foreign policy. And in some ways, it's now become the perfect out. We're talking about Trump's, first 100 days in office, and I really don't think there's any way you can objectively assess it without concluding that it has not gone well by any stretch of the imagination. And what is striking to me is the degree to which some of his defenders argue, well, you have to understand he's disrupting the establishment. He's disrupting the status quo. And so that is always the easy out if something goes badly, that it went badly by design, that the idea is we're trying to disrupt things and therefore create something new which will actually eventually be better. So it's the perfect non-falsifiable idea.
Yeah, it's amazing how important a label can be.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have used another word, but disrupt has so many applications that, are defensible. I mean, we're living in a time of rapid change. Stuff is getting disrupted.
Right.
And this also, made sense in Silicon Valley. If you accuse a company of, displacing workers or anything, it's part of disruption. So it is funny that way. Now, are you saying that the growing ratio of thought leaders to public intellectuals makes it easier for a bad idea to last a while before getting shot down?
Right, absolutely. So what happens is that, again, if there's a rough balance between the two, then if a thought leader promotes an idea, some of the ideas hopefully will actually become accepted. Public intellectuals might critique it and the critiques don't pass muster, or they might look at it and think, okay, there's something here, we might want to assess this. In a world in which public intellectuals are weakened, however, and there's no pushback, the idea, if it's seen as alluring, and certainly disruptive innovation was seen as particularly alluring, as I said, particularly in Silicon Valley, the idea is going to continue to spread and spread and spread and be applied to more and more sort of cognate fields, as it were, until it eventually becomes so large that the remaining public intellectuals begin to notice, oh, this is being talked about. Well, this seems silly. Let's take a look at this. And if it doesn't pass the stress test, then eventually you will experience some pushback. But by that point, it's almost like an overinflated asset bubble. So in that sense, the metaphor that I realize is that the marketplace of ideas now functions a lot like financial markets, which means there are booms and then there are busts.
Yeah. No, it does seem like in the past, before these things that you described started happening, it was certainly possible for dubious ideas to carry the day for a while.
Sure.
I was thinking of an interesting... Two names came to mind that I think you don't get into in the book. One is Arnold Toynbee, who had this grand cycles of history theory that probably hasn't fared well on close inspection, right? But he was like on the cover of Time magazine.
Right.
Now, an interesting contrast, I think, with the modern thought leaders, I don't know that he was a big self-promoter. I don't know if you know how he became famous, but a critical link was that, he wrote this like 11 volume or something treatise.
Yeah.
Totally inaccessible to everyone. He had a fan who kept writing him and saying, I'd like to boil this down for you, to 2 volumes. And right. Toynbee didn't even answer him. Finally, the guy just did it. And he created a 2-volume version. Now, that's what Henry Luce read. Yeah. And he put him on the cover of Time magazine. So I got a feeling that Toynbee wasn't full of the kind of self-assertion and self-promotion. But so that's consistent with your your view that things used to be different. But the idea, he did get a lot of play for a while, right? And I think now we would look at that and go, I don't think this holds up, probably, right?
No, I mean, I think there are some issues. I'm smiling though because when I remember when I was in high school, one of the things I did when I was was like trying to extend Toynbee's like map of civilizations, because I remember the first time I looked at it, I said, this is absurd. It's only Western civilizations. There's no it wasn't really covering other parts of the world. And so my teacher said, okay, run with that and create this new map. Which,
really?
So I always have a bit of nostalgia whenever anyone brings up Toynbee. But yeah, no, absolutely. That's certainly a case. Your point actually highlights something different as well, which is the marketplace for ideas now is just a hell of a lot more crowded than it used to be. Mm-hmm. As you say, if Henry Luce thought you had an interesting idea and you get on the cover of Time magazine, congratulations, you have arrived. You are now part of the priestly class. That might still be the case now, but it's also the case that you can potentially rise through a whole variety of alternatives.
You had to have the blessing of one of the priests in the old days.
And now you don't necessarily need to have that blessing. So that's also so Toynbee, when he arrived, had the intellectual pedigree and he had the academic bona fides, or bona fides. And I remember when I started blogging, that one of the reasons I got, the New Republic, I think, got in touch with me originally when I started writing an online column for them, was because I was able to blog, but they saw, oh, you're a professor at the University of Chicago, so you've got the rest of the bona fides, we can actually, put you forward. I'm not sure they would have cared now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then another person that comes to mind in connection with Toynbee is whatever the name of these people. Oh, Howe is one of the Cycles of History book that Steve Bannon latched on to. Do you know this? Oh, the generations, the fourth turning, and all this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't get into them in the book, but it's an interesting contrast because they seem a little more like modern thought leaders. Their credentials are more dubious than Toynbee's. Yeah. The idea probably less tethered to reality than Toynbee's.
But they sound really sure that they're right.
Yes, absolutely. This can explain everything, and they convinced Steve Bannon. He thinks we're approaching the fourth turning.
Right.
And so I guess that's an interesting, that makes sense, I guess.
Right, and the other thing that thought leaders often excel at, and this is, in essence, they're able to turn any criticism thrown their way into a strength rather than a weakness. I don't talk about this in the book, but I do think this is an element in which they're successful, which is to say, I'm making this provocative argument. Indeed, it's so provocative that all of the traditional folks, the mainstream people, are telling me that I'm wrong. What are they so scared of? Why are they, if they're all insisting that I must be wrong, then I've got to be onto something.
Right.
And that's very appealing to a certain category of people. And it also helps to explain Trump to some extent.
Exactly.
If Trump functions as anything, he functions as the brassiest thought leader in existence, which is to say, when he's talked about foreign policy, he talked about shaking the rust off of America's foreign policy and how he was going to rely on people who he didn't care about their sterling resumes. He just didn't want them to be architects of past disasters. And that certainly resonates with a certain, fraction of the public that takes a look at the legacy of American foreign policy and sees the invasion of Iraq or the 2008 financial crisis or what have you. I mean, one of Trump's best lines that he could sell when he was running was, what the hell do you have to lose? Now, as it turns out, there's a hell of a lot to lose. But for a lot of certain category of voter, that seemed to ring true because it seemed like the elites weren't necessarily getting anything right anyway.
Yeah, no, the scorn of the elites is a badge of honor.
Right.
In intellectual and political realms, both,
exactly.
I guess. So you don't you don't talk much about any kind of systematic ideological per se bias being exerted by the new environment, right? you don't get much into like Silicon Valley libertarianism or Eric Alterman wrote a piece about your book, which was kind of nice, but his one gripe was that as the proper leftist that Eric is, he would like you to have gone more into the way money corrupts the think tanks and more carefully or more closely link like money to ideology, kind of like base to superstructure, as I guess as a Marxist might put it.
Yeah. Well, let's just put it this way: I'm not a proper leftist, so I'm not surprised that Alterman wanted me to do that and that I did not. The other thing is, to be honest, and maybe this was I didn't want this to be a book where it came across as saying, I think there are these things that are happening, but let's be honest, it's all conservatives' fault. Because I don't think that's true, and I've interacted with enough of them to know that while there's certainly hacks like, let's say, Dinesh D'Souza out there who are going to be perfectly willing to cater to the base, there are intellectuals that genuinely believe in these ideas, and as I said, it's one of the ways in which I think the sort of pay-to-play accusations are wildly overhyped, because very often the people that want to write about certain ideas genuinely believe them to be true. Someone like Neil Ferguson is delighted to talk to financial experts and talk to them about the power of free markets because Neil Ferguson genuinely believes in the power of free markets. Tom Friedman is a similar, sort of attitude when he talks to corporate CEOs. He thinks corporate CEOs are kind of the world's, heavyweights now, or someone like Parag Khanna, who also makes that kind of
Let's get into Parag Khanna. No, I mean, I'm sorry. I know him a little. Look, perfectly nice person. But go ahead and talk about Parag Khanna.
Oh, Parag Khanna.
I have a little anecdote that I will share after you talk about it.
Well, let me put it this way. I think I've benefited tremendously from the fact that I've never met Parag Khanna. We actually recorded a Blogging Heads. This is one of those great. I am so disappointed. It's a lost Blogging Heads.
Oh, yes.
Because when his first book came out, we did I read the book and we had a conversation, and I actually thought I did a relatively effective job of kind of skewering the ideas. That said, the recording got lost. It never got public. It never went live, which I'm bitterly disappointed by because I had to read that book, which was painful. But anyway, Khanna has continued to sort of succeed or fail upwards, publishing book after book.
Has he? Is he really rising? I can't tell. I get emails from him, which is my anecdote. Wait, I have to tell you this.
Okay.
It's not, emails to me personally. I mean, I have the blessing.
You're on his email list.
I'm on his email list. Me and a select group of several million other people. But there's this theme in your book that thought leaders are now, they're more self-promoters. And I swear to you, at one point he sent an email about a book coming out, and it was like if you buy the book, you'll be eligible for a prize. I swear, it totally blew my mind. I should find it. I should go find it and dig it up. It was like, and I thought, are we in an environment where this is actually a rational tactic? This really makes sense? And I thought, well, maybe this is one of the many things I'm doing wrong. I don't offer prizes to people who buy my book.
Well, why the hell not? I mean, who doesn't want a prize? I mean, I think Khanna was, the thing I would argue about the first book is that what Khanna benefited from was great timing and apparently a brilliant publicist. Because he wrote a book about essentially the decline of the United States just at the start of 2008. And then if you recall, there was that cover story that was excerpted from the book in the New York Times Magazine. Right. And that vaulted him, I say this in the book, that vaulted him to the next tier. And he has written, I think, 3 or 4 more books since then. I had to review one in the New York Times, the connectography one, which came out last year, which is a really bad book. There's just no other way to put it. And he's got a book out, I think, this year. I think he just came out with a recent book basically arguing that the rest of the world should be more like Singapore, I think. But I haven't looked at it. But what Khanna excels at doing is he has like 5 different, irons in the fire, as it were. He's a consultant. He writes for CNN. He produces these books. He will write op-ed after op-ed, and he's very good at marketing his own content. and selling himself as this, quote, global strategist, which is one of those titles that sounds really awesome until you actually look at it and think, well, what does that mean exactly? And so, one has to admire, I guess, the surety in which he promotes his ideas. And I don't know if you've ever felt like this. There are times where I hear someone speak, and I'm like thinking, this sounds like crap to me. This is just not believable. I can think of like 5 different reasons why this is wrong. But there's also a little part of me that thinks, but they seem so sure that they're right.
Yeah.
Maybe they are right. And I've always been envious of that. There are people that I know, and maybe this is what prompted some of the book, is that there are people I know in all walks of life that seem supremely confident that they are correct, and that has an effect on people.
No, it absolutely does. And, this is probably, you depict, again, the nonprofit kind of thought leader sector as growing out of the consulting business. And this is, I think, long been a critique of the consulting business, is that, these people provide information often of actually limited value, but they do a great job of sales.
Right. And I think the other thing that I talk about, and this is the problem that I have, to be fair, I've relied on, the work of like the McKinsey Global Institute or Goldman Sachs or what have you. And as someone who does political economy, I will say that there are times where I genuinely think they've been at the forefront of research, and it's taken academics a lot longer to catch up. Whether it was the beginnings of the 2008 financial crisis or the rise of sovereign wealth funds or the question of whether China was going to grow as quickly as people thought. In some ways, I think they were out front about that. But there are other things that they present as sort of these big, grand ideas where the problem is that they're relying on proprietary data, and you can't fact-check their stuff because they will say, well, this is based on proprietary data. We can't give you this information. We got it from our clients. And, fairly enough, they say, look, we have to honor our clients. But the problem is that it's often taken at face value, and that I do find somewhat disconcerting. Or that there are times where they're going to have their own biases at play, where political risk firms are going to hype a risk because, to be blunt, they want to scare the shit out of firms to get them into the front door, and then they can provide their bespoke research, or in which consultants argue this is the next big thing that you need to be paying attention to, whether it's automation or AI or what have you. And they might be right, or they might be trying to hawk their own particular services.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I'm having a pang of guilt about Parag Khanna. So I should say, there's something to be said for having good timing. I mean, if you started writing about the decline of America about the time it became relevant, I may say something. And broadly speaking, the things he emphasizes, a lot of them are trends you would, acknowledge. It may just be that he wasn't the first to point it out, and it's more a question of packaging or whatever. Has been some erosion of national sovereignty or whatever it is he's selling. Anyway,
no, that's true. Although I would argue, I had to review Connectography, and I would argue that there are a few interesting ideas, but there's a lot more fluff in that book than there are interesting ideas. But as I said, he's indefatigable in this sense. He just continues to produce book after book after book.
Well, this seems true of a lot of people who are prominent. You see it on Twitter. You're like, where do these people find the time?
Yeah.
I gotta say, you're a very productive person yourself. You can't. Surely you're not registering a major complaint about the ecosystem in which you're thriving, right?
No, as I said, this has been good to me. In the sense of part of the reason I started blogging in the first place, for example, was because I would try occasionally to publish an op-ed in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or what have you, and no one was, I'd email them stuff and there would be absolutely nothing. So suddenly, I had my own venue where I could publish something. So, it's been good to me. I'm hardly a superstar intellectual, but I would describe myself as upper middle class. But that said, I'm also wary of the effects it's had on me because I'm working hard as well. I'm writing for the Washington Post. I'm teaching at Tufts. I'm, writing this book and so on and so forth. And there are ways in which, what happens if you're an intellectual and you have all these demands placed on you, you become a little less of an individual and more of a factory.
Right.
And if there's one thing that intellectuals are bad at, it's management. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that you've seen intellectuals be prone to scandals in no small part, I think, not because they were intentionally trying to engage in plagiarism or sloppy fact-checking or what have you, but just because they're being asked to do so much more than they used to be.
You get into the Fareed Zakaria case in the book.
Right, yeah. But, you know, and I think the other thing that winds up happening is that these people, and here I'd include myself, and I don't know if you have this experience, Bob, where, you know, you're being constantly attacked on places like Twitter or in the comments section of what you're publishing, and what you tend to do is just very quickly learn how to tune that stuff out. And in some ways, that's a necessary survival skill. The problem I have is that it then becomes a slippery slope where you learn how to tune everything out. You learn how to tune all criticism out, because you can dismiss various critics as either trolls or partisans.
That's a good point.
Or people who are jealous of you because of your status or so on and so forth. And you get to the point where essentially the only people who could criticize you that you would listen to are people that you interact with. They're your close friends, and they're not going to do that.
Right.
Because they're decent people.
And yet the people who are thriving seem to me the people who are best at tuning it all out. I mean, it's like, you know, somebody's thriving on Twitter, Josh Barrow. You know, one thing he tweeted about he got into trouble for it, but, you know, about Trump supporters calling them fat slobs. Now, come on. I mean, that's just not... First of all, I mean, there are a billion things wrong with saying that.
No, it's a self-defeating thing, but at the same time...
But it's not. But I mean, his strategy of, like, erring on the side of trolling...
Yeah.
A strategy of erring on the side of trolling, by and large, works. It's rare that an act of trolling is fatal to your career. You know, I would say it's somewhat the same thing about Niall Ferguson. He's a little bit of a troll.
Oh,
right?
yeah. No,
and he is, in your book, a case study of a successful thought leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the other problem with this, and this is particularly akin to social media, so I can describe this experience I had, which is that, you know, about 2 weeks ago, I tweeted something out about something that Jeff Sessions said in a speech, reading someone else's tweet and reading a sort of a first draft, or essentially the first version of a Wall Street Journal article in which Sessions accused, you know, or allegedly described immigrants as filth, illegal immigrants as filth. And I was like, come on, you can't do that.
I saw this. I saw your initial tweet and then your walk back.
Right. So what happened is the initial tweet went viral, you know, so on and so forth. And then, you know, people tweeted back at me saying, like, you've got this wrong. And so I read I read more closely what the speech was supposed to say, in which it was very clear when he said filth, he was trying to address, you know, gangs like M13 as opposed to the wider category.
Wasn't there also a discrepancy between what the prepared speech was and what he actually said?
Right. He never actually said the word filth, as it turned out. The word filth was in the prepared text, and that was what the Wall Street Journal story based on. But anyway, I read all of this and thought, okay, I was wrong, you know, and I could have taken down the tweet, which might have made some sense, but then I was worried that if I did that, I was going to be accused of covering up the mistake. And obviously I said on Twitter that I was wrong, but I thought that wasn't enough. So I wrote this, you know, piece on the Post saying I was wrong about Jeff Sessions, where I sort of detailed the chronology of what had happened. And I was glad to see that actually did generate a lot of traffic, which meant that hopefully that overwhelmed the original tweet. And I should add here, this is an example of someone who's a good politician. I actually got a personal note from Jeff Sessions about this.
Really?
Yes. He sent me a very, very sweet note, you know, handwritten, saying, you know, thank you very much. I appreciate, you know, we all make mistakes. It was a, let me put it this way. I get why Jeff Sessions was confirmed now. I disagree vehemently with most of his views, but he does seem to have a degree of personal courtesy that I find, you know, it's disarming.
Southern gentleman.
Right. But here's the thing. I apologize. I think a lot of people either, you know, tweeted this or, you know, said something equivalent, never apologized. The amount of emails I got, even after the apology, telling me, how dare you, or I can't believe you did this, or very often they were like a week behind, so they didn't realize that I had apologized or what have you. It was amusing, to put it.
Did you get any blowback for apologizing from Trump haters?
A little bit, not that much, because I mean, as I said, I think I opened up the apology by saying, look, I disagree with Jeff Sessions on this, so it wasn't like I just said I got my facts wrong on this. I think Eric Rauchway wrote something in the Crooked Timber arguing that I shouldn't have apologized, but he's a decent guy, and I can't, I'm not going to disagree with him on that necessarily.
Okay, a couple of closing questions. One is, has the thought leader business actually influenced the kind of people that academic institutions look for? Because, like, I gotta say, when Niall Ferguson got his gig at Harvard, I just thought, geez, do they not have any standards? Now, I know, look,
Well, wait a minute. Now, come on.
You say yourself in the book he has a reputation as being a hack. I think he is a little bit of a hack. Maybe it's more troll than hack, but he will say outrageous things that a careful academic would not say in a considered piece of analysis.
So this is the tricky thing, I think, for universities now, which is, you're right that he occasionally does do this, and he's certainly made mistakes. On the other hand, he wrote a brilliant book about the Rothschilds, which has generally had universal acclaim. He's written other books that are generally considered quite good. So he has the bedrock of academic scholarship, which would allow someone like Harvard to employ them. And I think the answer is that, to get to your point, what universities are now much more interested in, which they didn't used to be, is impact.
Right.
Which is to say, not just are you producing good scholarship, but is that scholarship or are your arguments permeating their way into the public sphere? And that was different than it used to be. I remember when, I tell the story in the book, I remember when I was at the University of Chicago, and I'd been trying to crack foreign affairs because I thought people read that. And I got my first article accepted, and I was told that it was going to be the lead article in Foreign Affairs, which I was pretty pleased by. And a senior colleague of mine, saw me in the hallway and said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm in a really good mood. I just found out I'm going to have the lead article in Foreign Affairs." At which point this person cocked their head, looked at me, and said, "Why?" And I had no answer to that. I was sort of stunned that it was thought it would be a bad thing that you would be publishing in Foreign Affairs.
I think these days, by and large, it wouldn't be a bad thing, would it? I mean, certainly a lot of universities.
And I genuinely do think that. I think this has changed in the academy. The argument I would make now is that in the old days, if you published in a place like Foreign Affairs, the New York Times op-ed page, and you weren't tenured, that was just a bad thing. It was frowned upon. It was generally thought to be not good. Nowadays, if you have, and this is an important if you have the peer-reviewed scholarship, you have the sufficient amount of that, and you do this other stuff, then it's thought to be good. The problem is if you only do the public stuff and you don't have the peer scholarship, then inevitably the narrative that will emerge is, oh, well, you're not publishing enough in places like the American Political Science Review or International Security, and that's because you're spending too much time writing for op-eds or blogging or being on Twitter or what have you. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a knife-edge property. And also, if you're tenured, then I think it's primarily seen as a good thing.
Right. So, kind of penultimate question, I guess. In theory, the fact that credentials are less important could open the gateways to a bunch of public intellectuals. In theory, you would think that they could say, "Well, I'm not at Harvard, but I would like, but here are my book reviews and my cultural criticism and so on." But why is it that, in your view, the balance there hasn't been this kind of balance between thought leaders and public intellectuals using the new entryways to public awareness?
I guess I would argue that actually I think public intellectuals have used these new entryways as well. I just think the problem is their intellectual style means they're not going to succeed as much. So there are certainly public intellectuals, even public intellectuals of a certain ideological bent. Think about the contributors to Jacobin magazine, or for that matter, American Affairs, or the National Review. They might, and some of them will actually break through. But I would argue that partly it's the style of thought leaders. It's which demographics are interested in this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the thought leaders that are going to cater to particular, subcultures are the ones who are more likely to thrive in this environment, rather than public intellectuals who aspire to potentially try to explain a little bit of everything, I guess.
Okay. And the final question, of course, is what is to be done? What would you do? Well, what's doable, and maybe what's not doable that you wish were doable. But anyway, what if there are things suboptimal about this situation? What should we do about it?
So, first I have to give the caveat of, I'm saying the drivers of these things are the erosion of trust and expertise, the rise of political polarization, and the rise of economic inequality. These are kind of macro things that I can offer potential solutions to them, but they're big problems in and of themselves. I'm just saying they're driving shifts in the marketplace of ideas. So trying to fix, assuming those things are given, in other words, assuming we can't change those macro forces or there are other things that can be done, I think there are three things that can be done. The first is potentially a search for greater diversity in terms of intellectuals, both, as you say, in terms of educational background, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of ideology as well. I think that would actually be healthy, not necessarily because these people are automatically going to produce better ideas, but I think it cuts against the superstar phenomenon. It actually requires, it's a way in which you can prevent just superstars from hogging the microphone, as it were. So I think that would be good. The second thing would be to urge repeatedly for more traditional sources of funding for intellectuals to stop being obsessed with impact. That I think one of the things that's happening is that you've got places like MacArthur or Carnegie or traditional universities as well being so obsessed with sort of quantifiable metrics of how their scholars or how their intellectuals are affecting the marketplace of ideas that they're failing to realize that long-term or long-run investments aren't necessarily going to yield anything in the short term. And this is an area where, by the way, I would argue that a lot of the conservative funders of the marketplace of ideas recognized this fact 30, 40 years ago when they set up houses like the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. Related to that, actually, I should applaud Aaron Simpson of Bombshell, which is another good foreign policy podcast, who suggested that one thing that would be worth doing would be to increase the estate tax. That one of the things that's driving this is that you have these, plutocrats, as I say, that want to fund certain ideas, but they're doing so while they're alive. And that it might be better for them to recognize they should set up these foundations that separate themselves from their money, which is an interesting thought. The last thing I will say, and this might be a weak read, but I think it's one that matters, is that essentially intellectuals need to police themselves. That we are presumably the one category of individuals that will not necessarily only respond to material incentives. And so we need to recognize these trends. And so if nothing else, I think publishing the book and hopefully making people aware of what's going on will at least cause certain intellectuals to fight against the kind of trends that they're falling prey to. And essentially I quote the last chapter I call the Dark Knight theory of the ideas industry, because I'm quoting Harvey Dent from the movie Dark Knight, which says, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And essentially successful intellectuals wind up potentially living long enough to see themselves becoming the very things they despised when they were younger and less wealthy intellectuals. You
mean they move toward thought leadership?
They move towards thought leadership, but also they move towards being, only looking up and not looking down and not listening to valid criticisms of their own work. Mm-hmm. And so essentially what I'm suggesting is we need to carve out a more sustainable path of being an intellectual where you can simultaneously put forward ideas but also nonetheless retain the capacity to recognize that you might be wrong.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dan Drezner. The book is The Ideas Industry. Fascinating book. Hold it up. How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas by Oxford University Press. Continued good luck in resisting the allure of thought leadership and remaining a public intellectual.
Thank you.
And what's your Twitter handle again? People can find you. You got the Washington Post blog. Yeah. Of course, the Dresberg podcast, to which people can subscribe on our very own website if they click the podcast icon in the upper left hand of the homepage of Blogging Heads. But what's your Twitter handle?
It's Dan Drezner.
Well, so that was not taken. That's the virtue of having a name like Dan Drezner.
It is the virtue of having a last name like Drezner. Let me put it that way.
Congratulations on that, too.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Well, thank you, Dan. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.